My name is Kelsey Hughes. Today is February 11th, 2019. We're at the Glenarden Branch Library, and we're recording as part of the Speak Your Truth Oral History Interview Project. Mr. Parker, could you just say and spell your first and last name?
My full name is Joseph M. Parker Sr., capital Joseph, middle initial M. Parker, capital Parker, and after Parker Sr.
Thank you. So can you tell me about where you grew up and what it was like growing up in the county?
Well, I grew up in Fairmount Heights, which is just a stone's throw from where we are now. I was fortunate enough to be part of a family that were business people. And of course, growing up in Fairmount Heights and observing my parents as they went about their daily activities associated with the business, I was exposed to a lot of people and got an opportunity to observe what life was like for not just my family, but other people who were probably not as fortunate as we found ourselves to be, in as much as we were a business family. My parents owned and operated a tavern. They owned and operated a barber shop, a pool facility, a grocery store, and a delicatessen. And they owned several pieces of rental properties in and around Fairmount Heights. So I had a close seat at the table, so to speak, to observe life in Prince George's County. Very early on, because of the need for police from time to time in the facility where alcohol was being sold. I had the chance to see how the police department treated people of color, and it made a tremendous emotional impact on me as I saw things that even as a young child I knew were not right with respect to the way we had a police force in Fairmount Heights, but they were limited by the Prince George's County Police only to handle matters involving traffic stops and stuff like that. Anything above that, they were more or less required to call the county police in. And once the county police came on the scene, it was obvious that they had very, very little respect and a lot of disdain for the local policemen, who were people that we knew and who would be the people who knew the people for whom the strong arm of the law was being applied, and could have more than likely dealt with those people in a more sober-minded manner. And that was one of the things that bothered me right from the very beginning as a very small child. Of course, I went to school, Fairmount Heights Elementary School, and there were a couple of white families living in Fairmount Heights who owned and operated grocery stores. People would refer to them as the Jew store because they were Jews, and that was typical of black communities. You'd have a Jewish family to come in and open up a store, and most of the grocery and other shopping for by families was done in those stores. And in many cases, the people being poor had what were being carried on the book, so to speak, if you understand what I mean. So they would get groceries, and instead of paying for them up front, they would pay by signing an IOU, so to speak, in a book that said they had gotten X number of items and that those items cost X number of dollars, and that they would pay those. That you never got paid. You never paid those off, of course. That never happened. And of course, when I'm leaving my home, say here on 60th Avenue where I live, headed to Fairmount Heights Elementary School, where I went to school as an elementary student, the Kaufman's family, the Jewish family that had the little store, was right here between my school and my home. As I'm going to Fairmount Heights Elementary, Budgie, one of the Kaufman boys, is coming out of it, and he's passing me going down to Seat Pleasant, which is the white community adjacent to Fairmount Heights, to their elementary school. So I mean, it was just so blatantly obvious that, you know, we were not equal. We had very, very little in the way of recreation for those of us who were black. We didn't have a playground. The Fairmount Heights Library that is there today was unheard of. As a matter of fact, it's right on the same spot that the Kaufman's grocery store was on. I hadn't thought about that till now. But it was obvious that there was a strict dichotomy, and across the street, diagonally across the street, was another Jewish store, Tony's it was called. So those two stores supplied most of the groceries and other needs for the families in Fairmount Heights, and it was done, as I said, on the book, so to speak. So those people never ever paid off those bills. They go in, and most of the people at that time who lived in Fairmount Heights were people who were day laborers. They worked in such places as the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission's water service. They were the ones who dug the ditches to lay the pipe. And when pipes froze up in the winter, I know that because my dad, even though he was a businessman, he also worked for WSSC, the Washington Suburban Sanitary Commission. And that was the employer for so many of the people in Fairmount Heights, the black folk, that is. And those who didn't worked at local stores, like there was an F.L. Watkins wood and coal and feed store, a big operation, where many of the people who lived in Fairmount Heights and Cedar Heights, there were three different areas, Fairmount Heights, Cedar Heights, and Jefferson Heights. Those three little enclaves were all the areas where black people lived. I remember seeing a person shot by a police officer when I was probably about 8 or 9 years old. And it just traumatized me to see that, because the man was somebody who frequented my parents' business. I don't know what he had done. It wasn't associated with our business. There was another tavern up the street called Sparky's. So something had happened up at Sparky's between this man and somebody else, and the police were called, and he wound up being shot to death. And I remember distinctly how traumatized my brother and I were, because it was summertime, and we were supposed to be asleep, but we were always watching the moving crowd moving from our parents' place to Sparky's, or Sparky's down to our place, and watching all the activity that was going on outside, people enjoying themselves and having fun. But there were occasions, as I said, when police were called onto the scene, and you could see that we were not equal under any circumstances. I don't know whether I told you or not, but my dad went from the Washington Suburban Sanitary Commission. He became an engineer for the National Geographic Society, and that's where he worked for the most part while I was going from my younger life into my teen years. And eventually he was lured away from that job to take on the job of being the building engineer for Fairmount Heights High School, the new school that was being built. And as a matter of fact, I had a cousin who's gone now, but he was always proud to say to people that he, working with my dad and others that my dad had corralled to bring the furniture into all the desks and chairs into Fairmount Heights High School on that late summer before it opened its doors first in September of 1950. And David, my cousin, was always proud to say, I helped to carry the first furniture into that building. And he did, no question about that. But my dad was the building supervisor there and who ran that facility. And even though, he still owned his own personal businesses, but he had made such an impact on the mayor and people at the Board of Education that they sought him out to take over that position. It was the first, as the gentleman said, first black school built in the state specifically for blacks. And Fairmount Heights became a laboratory of sorts, attracting people to the school from all over the state and even outside of the state, because we were the first school that had what was called the core curriculum at the high school level. Now, the core curriculum had existed at lower levels, at the junior high school level, but and there was no such thing as a middle school back in that day. It was the elementary, junior high, senior high. And up until Fairmount Heights opened in 1950, the last class that graduated from Lakeland, which I think I told you, if you live north of Central Avenue, Lakeland was the school that blacks attended. But up until Fairmount Heights opened its doors in 1950, blacks only attended school for 11 years. They graduated in the 11th year, not the 12th, after the 12th year. I never understood why that was. But Lakeland closed its doors in 49-50, school year 49-50. And Fairmount Heights opened its doors 50-51. But the last class to finish at Lakeland had only gone 11 years when they graduated in 1950.
So did everyone from Lakeland switch over to Fairmount Heights?
Right. All the students who had been going to, and see, I went to Lakeland, and Lakeland was, back in that day, it was like an hour's drive by bus. And I mean, the bus had to stop and pick up kids all along the route from as far as Central Avenue, which was the dividing line. If you lived north of Central Avenue, you went to Lakeland. If you lived south of Central Avenue, you went to Douglas High School in Upper Marlboro. And that's the school that I said was built right beside the jail and the courthouse. And so when many is the time, it would take you well over an hour stopping to pick up kids down in Bowie, in Lincoln, which is Lanham, various of those communities. Students left those communities far from Lakeland to catch a bus that took the better part of an hour to get you to school. And the buses that that carried us on those journeys were buses that were almost always breaking down. We had to go. My bus always had to go through Bladensburg, where there was almost always, during the rainy season, a flood. And the buses that carried us many times could not ford that high water, and the bus choked out, and we had to sit there sometimes for maybe a couple of hours before somebody from Upper Marlboro could come up to Bladensburg to either repair the bus, and sometimes they could repair it, sometimes they had to send for another bus to come. So, the whole day was lost by the time we got to school, and that was a frequent occurrence. And we passed schools like Bladensburg, where we broke down much of the time, Bladensburg High School, Maryland Park High School, Northwestern High School, which was closer to Lakeland. That's on Adelphi Road near University of Maryland. You know where Adelphi Road is. So Northwestern was the school for whites, which we passed. Bladensburg was a school for whites, which we passed. Maryland Park was a school for whites, which was very close to us, which we passed, getting to Lakeland High School. So, all of these things left an indelible mark on most of us as students. I know it did on me, I guess, because I like to think I'm a very sensitive person, and things like that were not lost on me, and I was always amazed and asking questions of my parents. Why is this? Why is that? And like I said, and that gentleman, Mario, did you say his name is? The other gentleman that's here.
Oh, Lawrence?
Lawrence, what's his last name?
Winston?
The man that was talking to me over in
I missed his schedule, I'm not sure.
Okay.
Lawrence something.
Okay.
Winston, I think.
Right. Well, as was said, then we had so many negatives that black kids lived with, and I was always questioning why. And of course, as I grew older, that kind of thing was even more intense within me, to ask the question, why? Why is this? And when after graduating from Bowie State, which is where I finished, which was not Bowie State University as it is today, it was Bowie State Teachers College. It was strictly a teacher's college. It had been, before that, a normal school, which was a 2-year program for training blacks to become educators. Okay. And it was just the normal school became Bowie State Teachers College, and of course then it became a 4-year teacher education institution. And then in the late 60s, early 70s, it went from Bowie State Teachers College to a liberal arts school where they began to give degrees other than in education. By that time, I'm teaching, and I'm teaching black kids at Douglas Elementary School in Upper Marlboro. That was my first teaching assignment, and loved every second of it. My parents were from Upper Marlboro, and so many of the students that I taught, I knew their families because I spent my summers in Upper Marlboro with my mother and father's extended families, brothers and sisters and the like, my uncles and aunts. And so I had not only cousins that were in the school that I taught in, that first school, but the friends of these kids that I played with when I was younger, and they were younger. Many of the kids that I taught were not only my cousins, but they were friends and of my family members. And I just enjoyed being there and doing my part to try and turn the tide against some of the things that I knew that they, like when I was a young person, had to be exposed to in a highly segregated system. I didn't stay there at that school but 2 years. The principal and I didn't get along. As I said, I've always had a very highly developed sense of right and wrong. And on one occasion, when we came back from the Easter vacation, we'd had a faculty meeting, and she had told us that we would no longer share our buses with Douglas High School. See, at that time, up until that time, the bus system that served Douglas Elementary School also served Douglas High School, which is down by the courthouse and the jail. So the older brothers and sisters of kids that I taught rode the same bus to and fro. And of course, the principal, as I said before, in a faculty meeting before that Easter vacation, told us that when we came back from Easter vacation, we would no longer be sharing buses with the high school, that we'd have our own set of buses, and the buses that served Douglas, because they were moving down on Croom Station Road. So they were moving farther away, so it was just made better sense for 2 different sets of buses to serve the 2, whereas they had been within a half mile of each other, within a mile easily of the high school and the elementary school. And on the day that we got back from the Easter vacation, I was the only male at the school. Men just didn't go into elementary education back in that day. Most of the educators all the educators that I had in my years in the elementary school were always females. I never saw a male teacher. The principal was male, but everybody else, all the classroom teachers, were female. And she said, when we come back from the Easter vacation, we'll have our own set of buses. And as the only male, I was kind of expected to be the one to go down 3 flights of stairs, as the school was built up on a terrace. And you had to go down a flight and down another flight, and then down to the horseshoe circle where the buses would come up and line up to pick up the kids. And I had noticed, along with some of the other teachers, as we stood up on the high ground, observing kids leaving one bus and going to another, and kids leaving this bus and going to another. And it was obvious that they were confused because of the change in buses. And they looked at the driver, as Mr. Lee was the driver. They figured Mr. Lee's still the driver of the bus that I have to get on because he's going to take me home. And so I went down to straighten the situation out, and I found that some of the bus drivers still had to carry, until they finished working the system out, kids to both from Douglas High School and Douglas Elementary. But the drivers had changed in terms of where they went, south on 301 or north on 301 or whatever. And I went down and I got it all straightened out. When I came back up to the top tier of stairs, one of the teachers said, "What was that all about?" And I said, "Well, kids were confused because they were getting on the bus whose driver they knew from the old schedule." And so, and I just mentioned that I said, "Oh, and by the way, some of them still have to carry kids from Douglas High School and from Douglas Elementary." And the principal said to me, I didn't know she was even there. She said, "Mr. Parker, shut your mouth. You're confused and you're trying to confuse everybody else." And I said, "I beg your pardon?" And I said, "Mrs. Young," and when I said that, a teacher who was my mentor, Jane Robinson, got in between her and me, and she said, "Go upstairs to your room." And I stood there for a moment, because that wasn't me. I don't run from a fight if I feel like fighting is necessary. So I listened to Jane, and I went up to my room, and when I got, after all the busing was over, bus schedules were satisfied, and teachers, it's now 4 o'clock and we can leave. And back in that day, you better not leave before 4 o'clock. I mean, even if you didn't have anything, all your work was done, your boards were washed, your work was run off for the next morning, and so on and so forth, you were expected to stay there until 4 o'clock. And so I stayed till 4 o'clock in my room doing things, preparing for the next day. And when I got my coat and hat on and got downstairs with my little briefcase and all, I went to the principal's office, and I asked Mrs. Ruth, who was the secretary. I said, "Mrs. Ruth, I'd like to speak with Mrs. Young, please." And I think I could sense that she knew what was about to happen. So she got up from the desk and walked in and told Mrs. Young that I wanted to speak with her. And I heard her say, "Well, I don't have time to speak with him." And I mean, she said it loudly enough that I could hear it. "I don't have time to speak with him. I'm busy." So when she came back and told me, she said, she just kind of put up her eyebrows. You heard what the lady said. So I walked over to her door and I said, "Mrs. Young, are you refusing to speak to me as a teacher who has a need to talk with you at this time?" She said, "Yes, I'm busy. I don't have time to talk to you." I said, "Okay. There are people in Upper Marlboro whose business it is to talk to me. So I will be talking to them." I said, "You have a good day." I went home and I told my wife, I said, "I'm not going to be teaching tomorrow. I don't have a job after today because I'm not going back to that school. That lady doesn't respect teachers. She talks to teachers like they're children." I said, "If I talk to one of my students like she talks to us, I would expect her to call me in and take me before the board for maltreatment of my students. And I'm not going to take any less from her in her treatment of me." So Mr. Hall, who was the black supervisor of the black schools, lived not too far from me. And my wife called him to tell him that behind my back, that I was not going back to school the next day. So he asked to speak to me. And he said, Mr. Parker? I said, yes, Mr. Hall. He said, your wife tells me you're not going back to Douglas tomorrow morning. I said, that's correct. And he said, well, what's it all about? So I told him. He said, you got a few minutes? I said, yes, sir, I'll take a few minutes. And I explained to him exactly what happened. He said, no, she didn't. I said, yes, she did. She told me to shut up. You're confused and you're trying to confuse everybody else. Those were her exact words to me in front of students and teachers, other, co-teachers. I said, and I don't take that kind of thing, Mr. Hall. He said, well, Joe, you go back there tomorrow, and I'll be there tomorrow morning to meet with you. And he called her Charity. That was her first name, Charity Young. And so he did. He showed up, and he had also seen to it that, because he had to report to his supervisor, who was I can't think of her name now. She was a wonderful person. And she was there, and she was his supervisor, Mr. Hall's supervisor. She and Mr. Hall and Mrs. Young and I met in her office, and she started crying that she had never mistreated a teacher. And I mean, that's all she did every day, was to badly treat teachers all the time. And I just wasn't going to tolerate it myself. But at any rate, they heard me out. And then she started crying while I'm telling my story, which is exactly what happened. I didn't fudge the story at all. And Mrs., the lady who was, what is her name? She reached over and patted Mrs. Young. Mrs. Young, now you just calm down, sweetheart. Your 20 years of experience speak well for you. Now you just calm down. And then she had an exchange with Mr. Hall, and then she turned to me and said, Mr. Parker, do I understand you say you're not going to return to teach? I said, yes, ma'am, that is correct. She said, well, what do you plan to do? Don't you have a family? I said, yes, I do. I said, but having a family does not negate the fact that I don't allow people to talk to me like I don't matter, like I don't have rights. And Ms. Young, started tearing up all over again. Hey, Joey. So at any rate, she heard, I heard her say, well, Ms. Young, don't worry about it. Your 20 years of experience speak well for you. And then she turned to me and asked me, do I understand you're not coming back to teach tomorrow? I said, that's correct. I said, no, I'll come tomorrow, but I want you to find a replacement for me as soon as you can. And she said, well, what are you going to do in the meantime? Don't you have a family? I said, I surely do. I said, but my goal right now is to get rid of the situation that I find myself in, where I'm being totally disrespected as an educator and as an adult. So Ms. Young sitting there crying her crocodile tears, and she said, well, would you let me see if I can? I said, well, Mrs. Allen, Rowanetta S. Allen. I said, well, Miss Allen, I said, in light of the statement you just made that Mrs. Young's 20-some years of experience speak well for her, I said, any further meeting can only serve to prove her more right and me more wrong. I said, I don't see any purpose served by that. She said, well, if you'll give me a few days. She said, I understand you have a degree in secondary education. I said, yes, but there were no secondary jobs available. So she said, well, if I can find you a job that you'd like, a placement that you'd like, would you stay? I said, well, that all depends. And in a couple of days, she called me and told me that she had found a job for me at North Brentwood Elementary, which is where I spent the 3rd and 4th years, and 3rd, 4th, and up to the next 15 years I was there. And I felt like I'd gone to heaven, to tell you the truth, because the principal was my 3rd grade teacher in the elementary school, Miss S. Beatrice Henson. And most of the kids that I taught were the progeny of students that I'd gone to Lakeland with, because everybody who lived on this side of Central Avenue went to Lakeland. So I went to school with most of the kids whose parents that I taught. And I was there for 15 years and loved every minute of it.
That's great.
Believe me. And that's where I went from the classroom to administration.
Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about, you told me about some of your activism and your protests and your involvement with the county government in different ways. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Mm-hmm. Well, I was on the board of directors of the Teachers Association, and there was always some battle to fight, because black teachers just were not treated like white teachers. For example, we had black females who easily won principalships, but black males need not apply. And that was one of the things that bothered most of the males, who are the breadwinners of their families, of course. So I brought that up at more than a few board meetings, that I felt that the Teachers Association was not adequately serving the needs of all of its membership, mainly its black membership. And I started a group, not all by myself, but I and some other disgruntled black teachers started a group called the Concerned Black Educators. And I was fortunate enough to be chosen to head that group. And being on the board of directors of the Teachers Association and having been chosen to speak for the black populace of the Teachers Association, or Teachers Registry in the county at that time, I met with and met a great deal of resistance from people in the Board of Education who were not willing to do anything to change that. So I called for the MSTA, which is the Maryland State Teachers Association, and we were the PGCEA. We were the county group, PGCEA, Prince George's County Educators Association, and then next was MSTA, Maryland State Teachers, and then above that was the NEA. And I called for the MSTA along with the members, other leadership members of the Concerned Black Educators. I called for those two groups, MSTA and NEA, to audit the services rendered to determine if black teachers were being served, who pay the same dues to the all three of those organizations that white teachers paid, but we were not being fairly treated in terms of upward mobility. And we had a big meeting, and I was authorized to say to the students, or to the board, that we were pulling our teachers out of various and sundry organizations within the Board of Education, and that until MSTA and NEA came back with their audit, we were not going to participate. And so I was prepared to make a statement at the next PGCEA open meeting, not the Board of Directors, but the open meeting where all the membership was in attendance. And I threatened to pull all of the black teachers out of that organization if we found, as we knew the audit would show, that we were not being served. We paid the same dues as the white teachers, but we were not being served in terms of upward mobility or assignments to committees and various and sundry activities within the board of the Teachers Association and the board complex. And they got the message. And they, oh, Joe, I wish you had told us. We didn't know you felt that way. You didn't? You know, we've been sending you messages subliminally for a long time. And you didn't seem to get the message. We thought an audit by MSTA and NEA would maybe get your attention. And after that, black people started being encouraged to apply for principalships and apply for supervisory positions and so on and so forth. So, and then of course in the outside community, there were cases when black people were being shot by the county police on a regular basis. And they would all go behind closed doors and come out with the finding, no cause for indictment, no cause for indictment, over and over and over again. And as a result of that, when Mr. Gullett, who was the first county executive, I think I shared that with you before, I believe. Up until that time, we had what was called the county commissioner type government. That was where good old boys from down South County would just appoint themselves as members of the leadership of the government of Prince George's County. And when they left office, they had appointed enough of their family members so that they would slide right into the position. Mr. Aloisi was the county sheriff, and when he retired, his son Jimmy Aloisi became the sheriff. You know, I mean, no voting him in office or whatever. His father just appointed him, and he became the sheriff. But at any rate, when the movement to change over from the county commissioner type government to a charter government, that's a written charter where you've got the executive heading the executive arm of government, the legislative, which was the the county council, that's the legislative branch, and mimicking the federal government, the office of law was the judicial. So we had the county executive at the executive level, the county legislators in the legislative, and then the office of law, which was and Mr. Gullett, being familiar with my strivings on my own, you know, whenever there was a black shot, I was out there running my big mouth. Whenever there was, you know, housing problems, and there were plenty of them, I was out there saying whatever I could say, and I wasn't alone. I mean, I had a lot of allies and a lot of people I allied myself with who were doing some of the same things and who felt as I did. Mr. Gullett, when he became the first county executive, called me in and asked me he wanted to get, he was going to establish the Human Relations Committee. And he said, but I wanted to become a commission under the county government. He said, and I want a bill passed. He said, and we've already started writing the bill. You can get involved in helping to help frame the language for that bill. He said, but I want a bill passed that will give us a county commission that will address race relations in police community relations, in housing, in employment, in public accommodations, and in, what was the fifth one? Did I say police community relations?
Yeah.
What was the fifth one? Housing, employment, public accommodations,
Race relations.
police community relations, and public accommodations. That's barber shops, any business entities that did not properly serve. That discriminated against black people. So he called me in and asked me, and I said, "Are you serious?" He said, "Yes." "What do you mean?" I said, "When do I start?" I thought he was going to fall off his seat laughing. And I didn't know Mr. Gullett that well. I'd worked with him, rubbed elbows or shoulders with him while we were all fighting to get the county commissioner type government. The county executive charter government, because I worked with the charter government movement. But I didn't know Mr. Gullett had even known that I was involved, but he did, and he asked me if I would do that. And I spent the next 3 or 4 years of my life fighting to get the Human Relations Commission bill, which was called CB1, County Bill 1. That was the first bill introduced to the legislature. And we fought for 3 years. Every time we went to a public hearing, they would find some other reason why the county council could not approve the bill. And I think it was at least 3 years it took us. And on one night right here in this town, Glenarden, at the town hall up here, there was a lady whose name was Teresa Banks. Mrs. Banks was an educator in Prince George's County. Mrs. Banks had been pretty much like I was, always the squeaky wheel that required some grease. And Mrs. Banks was principal of the school called, it was over in Bladensburg, Varnum Street Elementary School. And because Mrs. Banks and another lady educator, Mrs. West, the two of them failing to get the Board of Education to move on its own to integrate the school's operation and to get rid of a dual pay scale that they discovered that they had, Mrs. Banks and Mrs. West sued the school system. As a consequence, Mrs. Banks, I don't know about Mrs. West, but Mrs. Banks was always out there having a big mouth just like I did. She was always at every meeting, just constantly creating, unrest and dissatisfaction on behalf of black people, and especially when they found out that there were two different pay scales, one black and one white. And Mrs. Banks, who was sharp, was removed from her position as principal of Varnum Street Elementary School after she filed a lawsuit, and put back in the classroom. And she was selected, her principals were selected by the board on the basis of those who would control Mrs. Banks and give Mrs. Banks a hard time as much as they could. And these are black principals whom she had tried to get to join her and Mrs. West when they found out that there were two different pay scales. They wouldn't do it. And so when Mrs. Banks lost her principalship, they put her in schools where principals, black principals, would ride roughshod over her. And Mrs. Banks, sharp as she could be, wrote her own what is it that you write when you go to court?
Well, like a defense kind of a statement?
No, she wrote what she's going to present to the court. She wrote,
testimony?
yeah, it involves testimony and all the facts and everything. What is the word that I'm looking for, Joe? You've heard me tell this story before. But at any rate, Mrs. Banks wrote her own
Filing?
No, it's
Not filing.
no, it's not filing. But at any rate, she wrote her own, and the courts.
Petition?
Huh?
Petition?
No, not petition.
I'm reaching.
Yeah, okay, you're reaching. You're doing all right so far. But at any rate, she won the lawsuit based on her own filing of her own. They won the lawsuit. Mrs. West died before the suit came to fruition. Mrs. Banks lived to collect all that good back money that they had to pay her because of the two separate pay scales, one black and one white.
What time period was this?
That would be back in the
Late
60s, right, the middle to late 60s. And Mrs. Banks was a real thespian. She could, you go into her classroom, boy, she was like she was on a stage acting. Because I had the privilege of observing her teaching while I was a student teacher. And she just kept you and the students mesmerized. She came to the lawsuit. What do you call it, Joey? I'm still trying to think of that. What do you write out for your law? What do you present to the court for in your lawsuit?
It ends with an A, doesn't it?
Yeah, it seems it might. It seems it might. But at any rate, Mrs. Banks, who was, after they rode roughshod over her and she won that lawsuit, she just settled into her job as a classroom teacher, and she gave them the blues every chance she got, and there was nothing they could do, because in her lawsuit she made it crystal clear that if they were to harass her over this, like they had taken her out of her job as a principal and made her a classroom teacher, that this would create a whole new lawsuit. But at any rate, she spoke at almost every one of these hearings on CB1 after they kept denying. At Glenarden, right here at the town hall, right up the road here, she was on the agenda to speak that night. And everybody was poised, just to hear what Ms. Banks is going to say. And she got up and spoke, and she told the county council that you've been playing with this thing. We need to have equity in this county. And she made her long speech, and then she, as Mrs. Banks would do, she went into her thespian act. She said, every day when I teach my children, when I open my classroom and I have my children to recite the Pledge of Allegiance, I'm telling them to say something that's a lie. And you are responsible for me having my little black boys and girls to recite those words that are absolutely not true. She said, I pledge allegiance to the United States. To the what kind of states? She paraphrased each line as she went. And knowing Mrs. Banks as I did, and many of the other people, she said, with liberty and with what? Liberty. What kind of liberty? And she juxtaposed several things that were non-libertarian types of things. And what? Justice? You call this justice? We've had to fight for this CB1 bill now for 2 years. And every time we come to a hearing, you come back with some different reason why you can't pass this bill. And then the next thing I know, they said, Ms. Banks fell. She fell down on the floor. And I said, Ms. Banks is acting. I said, that's Mrs. Banks. I said, she's acting. I said, she'll get up in a few minutes and she'll finish. She didn't. Oh. They called 911 and the ambulance came, got Mrs. Banks on the gurney and took her out of the town hall right up the road here. And in about 45, 50 minutes, because the people in there, man, got really ugly. Really ugly. But they didn't get as ugly as they did get when word came back to the hall that Teresa Douglas Banks, and the Douglas was that she was a relative of Frederick Douglass. That's where her maiden name was Douglas. She was a relative of Frederick Douglass. The word came back to the hall that Teresa Douglas Banks was dead. And man, I tell you, you could cut the atmosphere in that hall with a board. You didn't need a knife. I mean, and everybody who spoke afterwards said, you're going to pass this bill tonight, or we're going to know the reason why. And the whole council wasn't there. There were just a few representatives of the county council that were there. But they were so shaken by the hostility that was directed at them after it was learned that Mrs. Banks was gone. Said, I guarantee you we will pass this bill. And we said, now you are just 2 people here. The county council, I think, had what, 10 people?
About 10 folks.
10 people. And they said, you are going to make sure that those other 8 vote like you voted tonight. Those 2 or 3 that were there voted in favor of, it was 3 of them there. And they voted in favor. And they guaranteed the crowd that they would be able to persuade the rest of the county council to pass that bill. And it passed. But it took us 2.5 years to get them to that. And the death of Teresa Douglas Banks to get that done. Wow was right. And Mrs. Banks and I were very good friends. I mean, all of my life I had known her as a career educator and what grandiose things she did for kids. And as a principal, she was just unparalleled. And then they took that away from her because of her filing of the lawsuit. And when she was buried, I mean, it was like a major celebrity had passed. I mean, the funeral cortege was miles long, believe me, for Teresa Banks. So I hope that helps to paint a picture of what life was like in Prince George's County back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s.
Yeah.
It was something else, believe me.
So what are kind of the biggest changes you've seen since that time?
Well, housing is one of the things that kind of opened up, even though much of the housing was still reserved for whites only if it was, real solid housing. For example, where I live today, where I've been since 1974 at 11701 Chantilly Lane, I was chairman of the county's Human Relations Commission, when I went into that office to purchase that house. And they did everything they could to deny me. And my wife kept saying to me, why don't you tell those people you're chairman of the Human Relations Commission? I said, no, I'm not going to do that. That's not what my job. Mr. Gullah didn't appoint me to this position so that I could use it for my own personal advancement. What does the next black man do who's got the green money enough and the credit enough to buy a house when he comes down and he doesn't have the connections to the powers of government that I have? No, I'm not going to tell him, and I never did. And it took me at least 5 to 6 months to purchase that house. Mr. Bell did everything he could to deny us the right to have that house. But somebody told him, I learned later, that I was chairman of the Human Relations Commission. I never told him and never intended to tell him. He told me that, Mr. Parker, we've got a list of people. He said, you know how when people go into the models, they fill out a card saying, you know, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, we're interested in model A or B or C or whatever. He says, we've got to go through the cards and find out how many people are interested in that RMED. The RMED was the house. Here's the office and the real estate office and the major model. Here is the house right next door that I live in today, which had a sign out front that said, this model is discontinued, no longer offered. And that was the house I was trying to buy. They didn't want me and my 3 young black male sons to be right next door to the major office and the major model that they have to show to people, you see. And as I said, my wife kept telling me to tell him I was chairman. No, I'm not going to do that. There came a time when he said to me that he had to go through all the cards of all the people who had gone through the models and had expressed an interest in the RMED. That's the model that I was trying to buy. And I asked him, I said, well, Mr. Bell, I'm interested in putting a contract. And he said, well, I can't sell you that house because you see the attorney for the group, for the real estate group, has expressed an interest in that house for himself. Well, Mr. Bell, has the attorney given you a contract on the house? Well, no, he hasn't. I said, well, that doesn't seem to me to indicate a burning desire on his part to buy that house. And I'm willing to give you a contract on it now. Well, you see, but then Mr. So-and-so, who is our developer or something, he was the assistant developer or something, he's also expressed an interest in it. Has he given you a contract, Mr. Bell? Well, no, he hasn't. So, Mr. Bell, we're playing games here. And I went over, and it's in this article in the paper. I went over to the wall. I said, you know, Mr. Bell, you're something else. He said, what do you mean? I said, look at this. Look at all these accolades you got on the wall here. Here you were $350,000 salesman one year, and then you $500,000. Here you went to $1.5 million. I said, you got all these accolades up here on the wall. And it took Joe Parker to come in here before you could find out that you had, he told me he had 180 some people who had expressed an interest in buying that particular model. And he felt a professional responsibility to contact those 180 people before he could offer me a contract. And every time I came, he had only gotten down maybe 10 or 15 people, and so on and so forth. And that's when I said, you know, Mr. Bell, I said, yeah, and I got a little bit vulgar. I said, you know, you bullshitting somebody. I said, well, all these accolades you got on the wall, and it took Joe Parker to come here before you knew you had 180 some hot prospects interested in the house right next door to you. Something's wrong with that picture, Mr. Bell. So his wife's name was Risa. He always said, Risa this, Risa that. And so he said, Risa, how many more cards you got? She said, Les, I think I'm down to about 15. So he said, 15? I thought you told me. They went into a little bit of a huddle, and then they came out, and she said there were only 5 more. All of this was just made up stuff, all of this, and I knew that. So I said, well, Mr. Bell, how long is it going to take you to get through those 5? And he said, oh, Retha's been working hard on it. I said, Retha, you've been busy as a beaver to get through 185 cards with people who are interested in that Ahmed next door. I'm proud of you, Retha. And I said it just like that. So I said, well, Mr. Bell, I'll tell you what. I'm going to give you 2 more days for Retha to get through those other 5 people. And if those other 5 people aren't interested, give me a call and let me know that you can extend me a contract on that house. So he said, okay. So I came there 2 days later because I was in school down at Bowie at the time, and I would come that way coming home. So I stopped down there, and he said, Mr. Parker, we got some good news. I said, what is that? He said, we're down to 1 person. He said, and Retha's going to call her this evening, and we've been trying to reach him. He's been kind of hard to get through to. But we're going to call him this evening. She's called him, and he's going to call us this evening and let us know whether he is interested in that house or not. And if he's not interested, I'll be able to extend you a contract on that house. And I said, oh, fine, Mr. Bell, that's good news. Retha, thank you. You've been busy as a beaver, haven't you, Retha? Just like that. I looked right in her, she's in the next room, but I looked right in her baby blues. And she said, yes, I have been working. I said, well, good. So the next day, he calls me. And Mr. Parker, guess what? I said, what? He said, that man was not interested in the Ahmed. I said, well, what does that mean? He said, that means I can write you. When can you come down and for us to go over the contract? I said, Mr. Bell, I said, aren't you commissioned for selling those houses? He said, yes. I said, well, I'm not coming down there. He said, what do you mean? I thought you were interested in the house. I said, I am. But you're commissioned. Why don't you bring your paraphernalia and all of your, sheets of affidavits and contracts and all, and come over here to my house, and we'll write the contract here. I mean, think of all the times I've been to your place. It's time for you to come here now, don't you think? So he agreed to come the next day. So when he came, we had arranged for him to come, I think, at 5:30 or so. We had dinner, and my wife was cleaning up the kitchen. The boys were in their room playing, and so I sat him down in the living room. He got all his little stuff together, and he was looking all around, and we had an unpretentious little house, but it was a nice little house. All oak hardwood floors, right, Joey? And we took excellent care of the lawn, manicured to the hilt all the time. So he's looking all around. So I said, Audrey, I said, don't keep Mr. Bell waiting, because he's got other things he's got to do. So she said, okay, I'll be out there in a minute. So he said, Mr. Parker, I hope you understand. I can't extend you a contract contingent upon the sale of this house. So by this time, my wife has come out of the kitchen. She's sitting there on the sofa with me. He's sitting in one of the chairs right across from us. So I said, what did you say? He said, I can't write you a contract contingent upon the sale of this house. I said, Mr. Bell, did I tell you I was selling this house? And here's my hand to God. I didn't know where I was going to get $1 from. I'm not lying to you, Miss Hughes. I'm not lying. And my wife looked at me like, you done lost your damn mind. So I said, did you hear that, honey? And she said, yeah, I heard. I said, no, he said, well, you know, I've got to get 15% from you down to buy this house. I said, you hear that, honey? Mr. Bell said, well, all we need is 15% to buy this house. And I turned back to him. I said, you see, Mr. Bell, we were prepared to put down 20%. And I thought he was going to fall off that damn chair. I'm not lying. And here's my hand to God. I didn't know where I was going to get $1 from to put on that house. I mean, I had talked with my realtor, and I knew he told me, he said, Mr. Parker, you got a whole lot of equity. The house cost me $10,500 when I bought it. When we moved, the house was worth $47,000.
Pretty good.
And I didn't know that until Mr. Kofer told me, Mr. Parker, you got more than enough equity in your house to buy that house. I knew that, but I hadn't shared that with my wife yet. And she almost fell off the seat when I said, we were prepared to pay 20% down. And I thought Audrey was going to have a heart attack. I swear I did. But at any rate, we got the house. And I told her, I said, tomorrow you and I have to take off from work. We've got to go to all of our creditors, make sure that that Bell and those don't get to them, and have them to fudge up our credit statement. And we went, she took 2 or 3 creditors, I took 2 or 3, and we went to all of them, and we came out with sterling reports on our credit from each of them. And we took it and plopped it down on Mr. Bell's desk, and I thought he was going to have a heart attack. But fortunately, we were able to buy that house. And I've been living in it now for April 24th. It will be 45 years ago. We moved in there April 24th, 1974, the year that Richard Nixon was impeached. That's how long ago that was. Well, I hope I've given you something, Ms. Hughes.
You certainly have. Thank you so much for your time.
Joey, you want to add anything that you think is germane about your life growing up in Fairmount Heights and North Englewood?
Well, if you would, just what's the framework? What's the scope of the conversation?
Let me pause this for a second.
Well, my name is Joseph M. Parker, Jr. I have lived in Prince George County all of my life. I have attended Prince George County Public Schools, and I'm a proud product of Fairmount Heights High School, a school where my dad was in the first graduating class. It is the oldest high school that I'm aware of. Maybe Frederick Douglass might be the oldest. But my grandfather was the first head custodian of that school. And my aunts and uncles, brothers and sisters of my dad's also attended. Even my son has attended the school. So it's just the town of Fairmount Heights alone is pretty central and very important to me. I graduated from Fairmount in 1975. I went to Morehouse College in Atlanta. And currently I'm married with a son, a few grandkids, and Prince George County again is home for me. Growing up, it was a great place. I mean, my neighborhood, though it was all black, was really like a middle class neighborhood, we felt. But as we got older, it really was, I mean, we really didn't have a whole lot, but we had everything that we needed. And I remember going to, we would go to Mass in the evenings, and sometimes that evening Mass was in Cheverly, Maryland. Mm-hmm. And I grew up in a Catholic church on the Maryland-D.C. border, right on the line, and it was all black. But when we went to evening Mass, we had to go to Cheverly. And I remember feeling like I was a fish in a bowl, and everyone in the church would be looking at us because we were the only blacks there. It's kind of a real eye-opener for a young kid growing up, realizing that there was a separation of equality. One of the biggest things, speaking of Shepley, that I also remember very vividly were in the 60s. To me, the 60s was a very gray period because we felt, we had a heartfelt connection with John F. Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and of course, Dr. Martin Luther King. When the Kennedy brothers died, I remember we went to the railroad track because word was that there was a train coming out of Boston carrying the body of John F. Kennedy. And blacks were on one side of the track, and whites were on the other side of the track.
That's true.
And we were all waiting for this train to come through. And it was just, I never felt that kind of connection to this president, who to us was very fair. He was a very fair president to Black America. Just a very unique feeling and a very unique time. Somewhere thereafter, around 1972, I was in junior high school, about to go to high school, but my last year in junior high school was the first year that the county schools integrated. So there was this conversation going on the summer prior to the schools actually integrating. So I remember at my dad's school at the time, he was the vice principal at Matthew Henson. They invited a few students, and I happened to be one of the students they invited just to come and have a conversation. And it was good because it kind of conditioned us as to what integration was going to be like. Because if you can survive this conversation, this will be an extension of what we're having during that summer. So it was good. I've never known what it would be like to ride a bus. That was another thing I wanted to just add. I walked to school from elementary to high school, and my walks literally got shorter and shorter the older I got because I lived right behind Fairmount Heights High School. We've been blessed because we lived in a village where truly there were some very special people in this little neighborhood. My dad, who was an educator, there was Mr. Jesse Wool, who was the first black member of the Prince George's County School Board. He was an advocate. He was an engineer, I think, by trade. Very smart gentleman. My elementary school vice principal lived right down the street. We had postmen. We had people who worked for WSSC. I mean, it was a real mix of professionals and blue collar getting along. I mean, we had a community situation where it was a low-lying area, and every summer when it would rain really hard, we had a park that would literally flood. The whole area had houses across, and people's houses would literally, water would fill their basements up and come up this part on the first floor of their homes.
Absolutely.
And they would have to leave their homes and would come up where we live, which was a little bit of a higher elevation than theirs, and we would just look at this natural disaster. So it was those kinds of things that kind of galvanized our neighborhood. It was just a very great neighborhood to grow up in. We were all very protected. But the one thing I wanted to add, and I'm going to kind of keep this brief because I know you've been here a long time already. My neighborhood I was just talking about was a really smaller area, but I would think if you would extend it out maybe a couple miles beyond that, all the teachers that I were in my elementary school, they lived in Addison Chapel apartments. This is very unique, and I'm only mentioning it because the black teachers at that time, they truly went to school with a sense of purpose. They wanted us to perform and perform well. But I can also tell you, every time we would get a book, we would always look at the front of the book or the back of the book, and you would see Bladensburg Junior High School, or Bladensburg Elementary, or Laurel Elementary, or Laurel High School. We were always getting secondhand books. There was a wrestling teacher. He was also my shop teacher, Mr. Eddie Ransom. And Mr. Ransom said, this is when we were getting ready to become integrated. He said, Parker, you know those wrestling mats that we've had to tie together? Now, if you could just think, if you ever been to a wrestling match, there's this big, huge mat that might be 40 feet by 50 feet or 50 by 60. It's huge. Well, at that time, we had wrestling mats that when you would go to gym, there would be a mat as big as this tabletop. And it would have these little handles on the side where you could move it around. We literally had to take those mats and we would have to tie the handles one side to another mat to create one big mat every time we had a wrestling match. And it was interesting because I never wrestled, so I never went to an away game or wrestling, an away match to see where the other white schools had a big mat. I just thought that everybody did what we did. But at the end of the last year before schools were integrated, to become integrated, we got this great big blue rolled up mat, and I was like, Mr. Ransom, what is that? He said, Joe, when white folks come, things begin to hum. I never forget it. And he said, that's our new mat. And I'm telling you, it was amazing. But those kinds of things still somewhat kind of linger. And I'm going to close with this. Fairmount Heights High School was built in 1950. The new Fairmount Heights High School recently opened about 2 years ago. I literally went into the high school to do a tour right before the school year began. And I went into the auditorium. We never had a stage in Fairmount Heights, the old high school. They made a makeshift stage in a classroom. So if there was a drama, if you were interested in drama, you really didn't have a real stage. You didn't have a real feeling of lights, camera, action. You felt like you were in a classroom with a makeshift stage. But when I went to the new school, I literally cried. It's beautiful. All those years of all those kids that wanted to feel like they were somebody, they never got the chance. So at least this way the kids moving forward, they'll realize what it's like to have all of what is needed to become the best that they can be. And to me, that auditorium is just beautiful. It really is. So that's my little take.
Well, thank you so much to both of you. I really appreciate your time and sharing your wonderful stories.
Thank you.
Thank you.